They lit the atrium like a jewel. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, throwing a soft gold over faces and collars. Cameras flashed in patterned stutters. A string quartet played a lullaby of strings that sounded more like applause. Men in tuxes cleared their throats. Women arranged their evening coats like flags. On the dais, beneath a banner with the hospital's name in embossed letters, Quaame Washington smiled as if the room existed only because he had willed it so. A woman in a dress the color of old coins rested her hand on his arm and laughed at whatever he said. The cameras loved that laugh. Akusa Cole Washington arrived late. She moved through the crowd with a measured step, the heel of her shoe striking cool marble in a patient rhythm that did not demand attention. Her dress was the kind of understated white that read like the last line of a long sentence, precise, unadorned. She carried herself like someone who had learned to make entrances by avoiding spectacle. A soft nick of a silver locket at her throat caught a bit of the chandelier light. She adjusted it almost without thinking, the motion practiced from 1,000 small preoccupations. Someone at the door saw her and murmured. The woman in old coin gold looked toward Akusa and smiled the predatory smile of someone who had already rehearsed that moment. The front row, where the hospital's founding and donors sat, had been quietly occupied, chairs moved, names rearranged, so that Quame's portrait of grief and charm would be perfectly framed. Security, instructed by a dozen polite phone calls, steered Akusa to a seat at the very edge of the room. She accepted the geometry of the space and sat, one soft hand on the swell of her belly. Across the room, a man who had been the chairman of the board for 20 years watched her with something like recognition. Reginald Ossie mouthed a greeting, and his eyes held the question he could not speak. How had the woman who had built these clinics, who had signed the first deed and argued the first loan, been reduced to an afterthought at her own gala? He had tried subtly to place her near the center, but the center had already been written in press releases. The lights dimmed a fraction. Quame's voice rose, congratulatory in the way that fills a room with a single truth. He spoke of sacrifice and love. He spoke of what it meant to lose a life and to honor it. The audience, primed by grief and applause, leaned in. Akusa watched him speak as if she were cataloging sound. She felt tired, the kind of fatigue that belonged to late nights and many small responsibilities. She felt the baby move, once, twice. Then there was a tightening in her chest and a kind of businesslike clarity. She needed air. She rose, and in the brief space between laughter and the next paragraph of Quame's speech, she left the atrium. Outside, a corridor smelled faintly of flowers and table polish. A coat check attendant offered a shawl that Akusa declined. She walked down a stairwell that led to a hospital wing where the marble gave way to quiet linoleum. The party felt like a faraway tide. She was not supposed to be at the gala, not in the official narrative. The hospital that bore her family name, that bore the evidence of her late-night signings and the files with her neat initials, had already acquired a mythology without her. It was a place people talked about at dinners, a place where her decisions had changed entire neighborhoods' access to care. But myths are made of stories people tell in the bright rooms of the world. The work of making the hospital real, making it run, making sure it had nurses at 3 a.m, agreements signed in the middle of a power outage, had been done in the quiet, under lamplight, far from photographs. She did not think of that then. She thought of being tired. She thought of small practicalities. Breathing. Grip. The word for the nurse she needed to call. She pressed her palm to her locket and felt the small, familiar weight of the photograph inside. A village at dawn. 2 thin figures under a mango tree. A girl whose hair had been braided by her grandmother. The locket was older than her childhood memory. Her grandmother had given it to her the night she left Ghana for a scholarship that smelled of diesel and promise. The night would fold quickly. In a small delivery room with a ceiling fan that did not match the formality upstairs, the band in the atrium sounded like another life. The baby arrived with all the blunt clarity of new things. There were 2 of them, twins, small and furled and bright as promise. Akusa held them the way a person holds ideas that have finally become real, close with a quiet, fierce attention. Then the machines hummed, an ordinary machine noise that suddenly felt cavernous. Doctors' faces moved through concern. A nurse's hands were steady and quick. Akusa's last image before the light shrank was of the locket lying on the bedside table, its chain coiled like a patient snake. When the hospital announced through public relations and proper-sounding statements that she had been taken into intensive care, cameras came back in waves. Quame's image on the podium became, in all the feeds, the story's headline. Grieving husband, 2 newborns, a community in mourning. In the atrium they hung a wreath by the portrait and called it a tribute. Inside, a quiet arithmetic was taking place. Later, as the band played and the chandeliers hummed like captive stars, someone whispered to a reporter that Akusa's condition was critical. Before anyone had time to understand the mechanics of her absence, a narrative assembled itself in half-truths and suggestion. The woman in old coin gold was moved closer on Quame's arm, and later would move into a house that once held family portraits on the mantel. People smiled and called it compassion. Others called it the future of the family. Names were shifted like cards. What the cameras never saw was how Akusa had built the hospital and the foundation beneath it. She had learned to read the fine print in language that could swallow meaning. She had learned which loans could be renegotiated, which community leaders needed to feel invited, which clinics could be folded into a system with the least resistance. She had learned the economy of visibility, to be noticed for the work and not for the speech, to be present in the ledger and not necessarily on the marquee. Keeping her name off certain public documents had been a strategy, not modesty. It was the way she protected work from men who preferred the performative horn of leadership to the hard grind of systems. That choice, a professional reticence, would become the bait that others used. If you had been there as a child, you would have seen her under a different light. In a village where the roads ran red and the mornings smelled of hot earth and papaya, a woman with hands like a potter's could see things that others missed. Her grandmother, who had the habit of attention, taught her to notice rhythm, how a market moved, how a river shifted with the season. The grandmother's fingers traced the silver locket onto young Akusa's palm and said, "Intui, pay attention." It was not an admonition so much as a tool, the kind that could be used to weave survival from noise. The scholarship that carried Akusa across oceans paid for certain kinds of tutelage: bioethics lectures in winter, lectures on hospital administration in small auditoriums heated by human ideas rather than steam. She learned to carry 2 languages, one of compassion and one of balance sheets. She learned to hire people who could translate goodwill into processes. She learned to sign and to hide names when naming would attract vultures to a tender place. Her first clinic sat in a neighborhood that had long been told it did not matter. She opened it in the kind of small office that smells like boiled coffee and cleaning solution. There were nights when she slept in a chair by the reception desk because a nurse called and needed help with inventory. There were mornings where she walked the blocks with a nurse and found out the names of children by asking mothers to tell their stories. The clinic did not have a ribbon cutting with champagne. It had a ribbon cut by a janitor and a pastor who believed in the work. When the city finally noticed, it noticed the effect. 100 fewer emergency admissions, a shorter walk for elderly women. The city liked effects. The headlines that later followed would call her visionary. She did not keep her name off the papers because she wanted obscurity. She kept her name off the marquee because she had learned that naming could be a theft. Men of charm and disaster would come with smiles and an appetite for stories, and she had decided that the work's continuity mattered more than the applause that crowned it. They needed legal fences, not good speeches. They needed bylaws that would not be rewritten at the mercy of charm. So she taught herself to make permanent documents the way a gardener teaches soil to hold water. Slow methods, careful amendments, signatures tucked where eyes might not immediately land. Quaame had been a contrast, not opposite. He liked the light. Where she preferred files and quiet meetings, he preferred the stage and barroom reputation. He was handsome in a way that made people forgive his thin attention for long moments. In the beginning, that charm had felt like someone giving a room a mirror, useful, flattering, amplifying. He could host a fundraiser and make donors laugh. He could stand in front of a camera and make the mission sound cinematic. He did not know the muscle of infrastructure. That had been her delight and her blind spot. She believed he could handle the public and she would handle the private. Their marriage, to anyone watching from the outside, read like a story with neat stamps. Law school dates, a wedding with a string quartet, photographs sent to the right pages. Up close, it was a complicated negotiation of who needed to speak and who needed to design the speech. Akusa, who had spent decades in hospitals and back offices, believed that love had the space to be negotiated. Quaame believed more in the performance of love than the stamina of it. When the babies came, every calculation reoriented in a way that was both biological and practical. She thought pregnancy would slow the momentum. Instead, she found a new category of urgency. Babies come with calendars and feeding charts and an economy of absence and presence. Akusa, who had built systems to make clinics run without her presence, imagined a way to make motherhood and leadership coexist. A schedule where nursing hours blended into board reports, where midnight feeds alternated with phone calls to a regional director. It was a logistics problem, and she liked logistics. The coma erased those plans in a single clinical sweep. The hospital's intensive care unit became a place of sustained humming, where the monitor's steady beep was the rhythm of an entire household rewritten. There were people in scrubs whose eyes did not show the underlining stories, employees who had long since been told to accept corporate contours. Yet in the margin, room 4B, an old nurse named Adoa sat like a gentle counterpoint. Adoa had been with the hospital since its early days. Her vigil was not performative. It was a quiet insistence, a human presence that refused to be rearranged by press conferences. Where the atrium filled with well-dressed faces and the public story tightened like a noose around a single narrative, those who actually knew the machine of the hospital recognized a different truth. Reginald Osi, who had watched Akusa sign her name on deeds and letters with a pen that never trembled, tried to speak, but his intervention was like a wind against stone. The public wants a tidy story, a hero, a villain, a grief. They do not want the complicated arch of a woman who prefers ledgers to spotlights. Within days, whispers slid through boardrooms and family rooms. Quaame had a talent for arranging hashtags and homilies. He arranged memorial posts and grief interviews in a cadence that felt rehearsed. He accepted flowers on camera with a composure that made people lean in and feel small for intruding on his sorrow. But in private, conversations happened like chess moves. Gloria, his mother, was a woman whose social instincts had been trained by a lifetime of arranging marriages and futures. She saw narrative as inheritance. Where Akusa had planned long-term legal fences, Gloria saw immediate positioning. They moved as families do, with a mixture of affection and self-protection. The mistress, Desire, arrived with the ease of someone who had rehearsed the role of consolation. At first she was a whisper at the periphery. The cameras liked her because she was photogenic, and because photographers love a story that evolves in predictable arcs. Abandonment, adoption by the family, a softer portrait. She moved into rooms that had once been filled with the laughter of toddlers. Her perfume had the sweetness of desserts. It was the smell of times when someone else had already decided a family's narrative. The hospital's staff, for the most part, continued the work they had been trained to do. Rounds, medication charts, patient education. Most of them were unaware of the fissures being built in the family's public story. Hospitals are ecosystems of small trades, one nurse covering the night, one administrator pushing for a grant. When the public turned its attention toward the stage below the chandeliers, the back rooms kept their steady labor. But there were pockets of resistance. Pet, who had been a friend for years and a lawyer by training, could not accept the erasure. She began to ask for files, to pull records, to travel to municipal offices where deeds sat like slow, indifferent truth. She made calls that were low and precise, the kind of calls that do not ask for drama so much as documentation. Adoa kept the other kind of company a person keeps when they believe in someone enough to watch. She read aloud to the patient the way one reads to soil, softly, to encourage a familiar root. She would tell the old stories that made Akusa's family make sense. The mango tree at dawn, the grandmother's hand, the smell of roasted yams in the rainy season. She brought small comforts from home, a packet of dried hibiscus, a seam of cloth with a pattern that reminded Akusa's mother of Sunday markets. In the hospital's sterility, those objects sounded like a geography of memory. In the first weeks, the story's management was a performance of grief. Quaame appeared on television with a face that asked for pity and for public trust. He spoke about community and loss. He thanked the donors. He accepted condolences. People left flowers at the hospital's entrance. The mistress smiled at cameras in a way that suggested that bodies had not yet learned the geometry of the hospital's legacies. Behind that polished image, legal moves were made. A few documents that had been tucked away were brought to table by men who liked the business of rearranging what was visible. Bertram, Quame's brother, had a hand in making certain files easier to access and others harder. He had a way with administrative forms the way Quaame had a way with cameras. Together with Gloria, he worked unnoticed at the margins, an energetic presence who could open doors because he knew which doors needed soft nudges. But the work that makes institutions last was not a thing easily purchased with charm. It lived in typed letters, in the scratch of a stamp upon a page, in the way a deed registers in a clerk's record, and becomes, in the eyes of law, a piece of the world. Those documents were scattered in locked cabinets, in records offices, in the hands of accountants who kept notes in light and dark. Pet, with the careful insistence of a person who trusted paper, began to assemble a counter-history. She wrote to municipal clerks. She traveled to county offices. She asked for copies of the earliest agreements for clinic leases, for the original minutes of community meetings, for the signatures on grant applications. Each photocopy she gathered was a small, solid contradiction to the narrative being formed in the press. Each one was a stitch in a seam that could be opened on a public stage. Meanwhile, family friends rallied to the public story. They sent platitudes, flowers, televised memories that framed Akusa as a pillar and Quaame as a grieving spouse. Those images fed into a communal compassion, a ready-made context of loss in which people wanted to believe. The mistress's role was simple. She was support, a softened image of the social lubricant families hand to grief when they want to recompose themselves. She accepted dinners. She smiled in high resolution. She played the part. The twins, small and needy, were kept close, but not always in ways that matched early plans. There were, in those first disoriented weeks, decisions about who would nurse and who would be the public holder of the child. Hospitals have rules about visitors, about who can be with infants. They have also human administrators who understand that family drama can be a long, complicated negotiation. Who got to hold the babies? Who got photographs to post online? Who was given the curated story to tell? All of these were contested, not always in open courtrooms, but in furtive offices and WhatsApp groups. Small scenes accumulated like rain. A nurse recognized the handmade blanket with a village pattern and placed it discreetly over a newborn's head while a photographer arranged light for a picture of the family smiling through tragedy. A hospital administrator called a PR company and asked for talking points that would keep donors calm. A board member suggested a plaque to honor the memory of a founder absent, and the suggestion was met with applause by those who preferred certainty to question. Akusa, inert behind glass and wires, existed simultaneously as a public absence and a pile of work. Her chest rose and fell, controlled by machines and by the chemistry of care. In room 4B, monitors mapped breath like a map, lines slicing time into quiet intervals. Adoa sat in the chair by the bed for hours and hummed old lullabies. She spoke to Akusa not as an outsider but as a human who knew the geometry of attention. "We are here," she would say. "We are keeping record." Petty, on the other hand, moved like a person who will not be satisfied by language alone. She cataloged, she made lists, she took copies of mortgage records and vendor agreements and emailed them to a friend who had server access in a way that would timestamp them beyond a doubt. She spoke into a recorder the names of witnesses who could confirm meetings and annotated notes on the edges of contracts. Her legal mind shaped the chaos into an order that could be presented in court, or to a board that had been leaning toward a simplified story. News feeds filled with split-screen images of Quaame at a podium and of many good deeds performed in his name. The hospital's donors wrote letters. There were calls for a celebration of life and funds were discussed for a plaque. The mistress began in public to inhabit the spaces where Akusa had once been photographed making rounds. She posed with pediatricians. She laughed and made small speeches about community. There were gifts from neighbors that read like resumes of allegiance. Yet in the quiet rooms where things are actually done, people whispered about timelines and deeds. Reginald Osei met with Pet in a small office heavy with files. He brought his memory like a witness to signatures. He remembered Akusa's handwriting, the loop on the J, the way she signed her initials on acquisitions long before anyone else had cared to notice. He remembered lunches where she had asked tiny, decisive questions about a vendor's delivery record. He remembered her speaking not for applause but for measurable outcomes. She built the plumbing of this thing, he told Pet with a soft, rueful tone. She laid the pipes. The people applauding on the stage tonight are using the taps she installed. Peta wrote those things down. She also wrote down the dates when leases were signed, when clinics were incorporated, when an anonymous grant had landed because Akusa had been in a meeting at 2 a.m, convincing a donor that a community deserved better than the current options. In time, the public narrative hardened. People prefer narratives that stop at a certain point, where the choir concludes and everyone knows which hymn is next. The cameras loved a version where the husband grieved, where the mistress consoled, where the board circulated paperwork like an answer. But behind those images, small acts of stubbornness continued. Adoa read aloud the same lullabies as if repetition could knit a seam. She hummed like a metronome. Pete kept making trips. She kept copying. Reginald remembered and spoke to those who would listen. Akusa's own body, meanwhile, occupied an odd limbo between work and absence. Her name was both on and off official papers, depending on who filed the query. The locket, when it went down the washing into a metal sink and then back into a small pile of personal effects, remained the most honest thing in the room. It did not speak, but it held the photograph of a village that seemed, to those who looked, the only true compass she had ever had. What you build in silence will speak for you when the time comes, someone might have said in a different life. It hung in the air like a proverb that had not yet found the right mouth. Months extended themselves like a slow season. The hospital's social feed posted helplines and memorial images. There were tributes and well-wishers. Quaame continued his appearances with the reflexive ease of a person well-practiced in the optics of sympathy. He had speeches that fit neatly into 2 minutes and quotes that could be cropped for social. The woman who had once been in the background, a quiet force who had signed first drafts, who had visited clinics with lists and pens, was now literally and publicly backgrounded. In small acts of resistance, Adoa and Pete worked. Adoa spoke to Akusa's hands as if hands could hear. She would lay out small bowls of the rice the grandmother used to cook and read news stories aloud. Peta pressed paper to her chest, like a map of future argument. She kept a legal strategy that would require time and patience, the retrieval of originals, the testimony of witnesses who remembered meetings, the digital traces that proved who paid for what and when. There were moments of private anger from the people who had seen the inside of the machinery, the staff who remembered being lectured by a woman whose hand shook not from fear, but from always being the first to put on a coat and leave for the clinic at dawn. They had been stewards of something they had no right to name, yet in the public square, the preferred story prevailed for months. Sympathy is easy to sell, inconvenience is not as palatable. By the end of that long season, Desire, the woman with the perfume that smelled like pastries, began to seem not merely a presence but an occupant. She attended dinners and accepted the toast. She accepted a seat at a board picnic and smiled in a way that suggested the future might be gentler than the past. The twins, who had been small enough to nap in a sling, began to grow into a narrative that could be photographed and shaped into press statements about continuity. But a dossier had been started. Pet's files grew into a stack that bent the spine of the legal briefcase she carried. Evidence is a slow loom. It requires time to be woven into proof. Documents had dates and signatures. They had the faded stamp of a clerk's office that recorded a deed long before anyone thought to claim a headline. There were invoices with Akusa's initials, bank transfers with the coded notes of a careful mind, emails with strategic sentences that read like fingerprints. Reginald arranged a quiet meeting with 1 or 2 board members who had not yet been seduced by spectacle. He put paper across the table and said very little. "This is what we owe to truth," he said. He did not promise headlines. He promised evidence, which felt to him like a kind of moral plumbing, small pipes that would eventually let the water of truth run where it had always needed to go. In the weeks where the public story cascaded on a loop of carefully curated grief, the quiet work continued. The hospital, an organism with thousands of small intentions, kept running. Nurses changed shifts, donors wrote checks, infants were immunized. The world wanted to believe that the architecture of care could live without the founder present, that systems would run like machines. For the people who knew the wiring, that was a hazardous assumption. In one late-night office under the poor light of a desk lamp that glowed like a promise, Petey and Reginald laid out the first folder. It was thicker than they had expected. It contained signatures and invoices, and the first formal lease to the clinic that had opened in a neighborhood no one else had wanted. It contained in a single undeniable sheet Akusa's name with the looped A that every clerk remembered from meeting her. They sat with the folder as if it were a relic. Outside, the hospital's atrium would one day flush with flashbulbs and the echo of speeches. Inside, in little offices, and in the living rooms of people who had actually known the work, pieces of truth collected like small stones in a hand. And yet the public story had a gravity of its own. People began to assume the shape of the staged version, and assumptions are stubborn. They adhere to surfaces. They cruise social feeds in a rhythm that makes correction difficult. The narrative cultivated by photos and by a steady, sympathetic husband had the metastasizing pleasure of simplicity. It required little thought to understand. The opposing story, the one made of documents and signatures and long, patient work, needed translation. It required a person to sit down and read. That translation would happen later. For now, the hospital's life spun on two axes. Spectacle on the one hand, slow, stubborn institutional fact on the other. Akusa, whose fingers had once typed budgets in the quiet of a midnight office, lay in room 4B where the monitors kept a patient, impartial tally. Her locket was still close to her chest, a small anchor in a room of white sheets. On the nights when the atrium's chandeliers flashed in the city's social memory, Adoa pressed her palm to the mattress and spoke to the woman she had watched learn and lead. She hummed simple songs. She told stories that were small enough to be remembered. The lullabies were not political. They were a line of tender incompetence designed to keep a life warm. Outside, the city's headlines did not know how to stop telling their tidy story. Inside, the slow work of assembling a dossier, of cataloging truth, continued. The stakes were the hospital and the children and the right to a name. The stakes were the difference between work that shows and work that is real. A stranger walking into the atrium might have seen only glitter and sympathy. A stranger walking into room 4B would have felt a different temperature, a coolness of air, the gentle keening of machines, the presence of people doing what was necessary without applause. The contradiction between those two rooms was a thing that would, in time, need to be reconciled. For now the machines recorded breath. The family narrative had already been set in motion. Papers were being copied. Adoa kept watch like a plant that will not stop growing. Petty's casework piled into a small mountain of records. The man at the podium kept smiling for the camera. The woman in gold kept taking her place in photographs. The world, as it always does, prepared for the next image. What you build in silence will speak for you when the time comes. The locket felt heavier in the dark, as if it too were collecting testimony. The work that had been done in the quiet hours, contracts, clinic turnarounds, the careful redistribution of resources to neighborhoods, was a slow vocabulary that would not be easily wronged. It only needed time and a patient set of hands to say where the commas belonged. 8 months then stretched ahead like a map with one path marked out by flashbulbs and another by typed stamped paper. A patient, a founder, a community's future. These were the elements on that map. Men rearranged the furniture of stories upstairs while a small cohort below rung the bell of documentation. The next scene would not be about theatrics. It would be about paper, about witness, about a name that could be read in a ledger and finally recognized in a room full of people who had already decided another truth. In the quiet of a small office with the faint smell of coffee and paper, Pete wrote down a list of names. She placed them beneath the folded folder with the original lease, the one that bore Akusa's signature like a small, proud mark. She added a note. Call municipal clerk. Request certified copies. Speak to nurse who ran clinic supply lists, AO911. Each item was a simple mechanical step, but taken together they formed a plan. Outside, in a world that preferred the arc of sorrow with a single charismatic center, the stage was being quietly rebuilt. The soft hand on the locket shifted in an unconscious movement, as if the thing might answer back. The hospital hummed its indifferent tune, and in room 4B the monitors kept time. Adoa hummed a lullaby that had no audience but the woman who had once learned to pay attention. Adoa hummed a lullaby that had no audience but the woman who had once learned to pay attention. The sound threaded through the long nights and low afternoons. It passed across monitors and over the thin privacy curtain into a hallway, where cleaning carts squeaked, and a security guard folded a newspaper. It reached the hands that turned pages, the hands that typed notes into systems, the hands that had for years answered to the rhythm Akusa set without needing her name on a plaque. Then one morning that smelled faintly of roasted coffee and the coming of rain, the monitor's line did something small and new. It kinked, as if someone had drawn a breath into a room that had been holding its own. Adoa, who had learned to read the tide of a patient's body like weather, straightened as if someone had called her name. She wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist, simple and practical, and touched the blanket at Akusa's shoulder. Akusa's fingers twitched. Her eyelids fluttered like the last page of a book being closed and reopened. The locket on the bedside table caught the light from the window and blinked twice in the same way a person blinks when sunlight finally finds them. She woke with no ceremony. Her first awareness was small and precise, the weight of the locket against her skin when the nurse, Adoa, slid it into her palm. The slow, reliable cadence of a human voice she had heard for months, saying simply, "We kept you." Her throat was dry. When she tried to form words, they were at first like objects that had not yet remembered their shape. She felt the hollowness in the seam of time like a dress that did not fit. There was cotton in her mouth and the rustle of hospital paper. Then, with the deliberate economy of someone who has always chosen her sounds carefully, she said one name. Pet. It was a small demand, and a compass. Adoa's face broke into something that was equal parts relief and calculation. She called out in the way nurses do when small urgencies become large opportunities. Petty arrived within the hour, hair pulled back, legal folders clutched like talismans. She entered the room and stopped. And the look she gave Akusa was not the kind of performative awe the cameras prefer. It was the look of a person who had been assembling a case and had finally found the witness to sign the affidavit of truth. They did not make a spectacle of the moment. There were no cameras at the door, no press releases announcing that the founder had rejoined the living. There were quiet, rapid practicalities, a doctor's check, a neurologist's measured questions, a set of physical therapy steps that would rebuild what 8 months had mothballed. The staff created a discreet cocoon around room 4B, schedules shifted, visiting lists adjusted, privacy afforded like a small mercy. Akusa's awakening was not framed for the stage. It was catalogued fingertip by fingertip into a plan. The plan began not with speeches, but with paper. Akusa, once able to read a balance sheet the way other people read a map, opened her eyes and reached instinctively for the folder Petty had left on the chair. Her fingers, slow at first, found the edges of photocopies, the texture of paper stamped with municipal office seals. She looked at a deed, at a clinic lease signed in a handwriting she recognized because she had practiced that loop of the A until clerks learned to expect it. She sat up, and the hospital room shrank to a table of work. "Call Reginald," she said once she had steadied a grit of breath. The words were clipped and efficient. They carried no need for ceremony. Reginald came within the day. He arrived with a brace of documents and the weathered patience of someone who had been stewing evidence like tea for months. He stood at the foot of the bed and presented the first public step: certified copies, sworn statements from administrators, timestamps from servers where Pet had routed invoices to preserve their authenticity. "The board will need this," he said. He did not offer comfort. He offered procedure. So Akusa learned again the rhythm of governance: what papers to sign, which authorities to notify, whom to call to begin the legal work, that would translate ink into immediate protection. They moved with the economy of people who knew how institutions bend when their skeleton is nudged correctly. Petty arranged a meeting with a district attorney who had, until now, been a name on a list. She took the certified copies and placed them on the DA's desk like a litany. She spoke plainly about the maneuverings she had observed, the reallocation of signatory authority, the sudden changes to account access, the presence of a woman newly situated in the family home with a social media feed curated for sympathy. The DA listened because the papers demanded it. The DA ordered a forensic accounting team to open the ledgers. The DA requested temporary freezes on accounts tied to public donations and corporate distributions pending verification. Papers were served. Asset freezes followed. The legal language did the quiet work of a public heartbeat, technical, precise, irrevocable in its smallness. At first, those in the public eye continued to perform their roles as if nothing had shifted. Quaame continued to give interviews where grief was rendered into tidy, comforting phrases. Desire smiled for cameras as if someone had given her the part, and it fit. But when legal notices began to arrive on the boardroom table in the hands of lawyers, via served a process server who had the blunt efficiency of an institution, the image began to fray. There was a moment, recorded and leaked in the way news can be opportunistic, when papers were handed across a large mahogany table to a board member who had long felt uncomfortable with the spectacle. The camera that photographed that handover was not invited. It was the instrument of a public that noticed a different kind of drama, one with numbers and signatures rather than tears and music. The photograph of a file stamped Exhibit A would circulate and be examined like a relic. Akusa herself insisted on little in the early weeks. She refused podiums and cameras. She took meetings in a small conference room with blinds that kept the glare off the documents. She asked questions about chain of title and the signatures on specific vendor contracts. She requested original invoices for renovations at a satellite clinic and asked precisely why a large check had been routed through a shell account before being returned with a memo that excused the transaction as consulting fees. She did not rage. She did not need to. Each question was a line in a ledger that traced the architecture of truth. Meanwhile, a different kind of theater played out in the house that once had the family portraits. Desire packed some boxes and in endearing videos for her followers placed a few staged frames of taking a step back to reflect. Gloria retreated to social calls that were less public than they had once been. She attended fewer luncheons. Bertram's routine was interrupted by an investigator who wanted to know about document access, when he had signed them, who had authorized certain changes in the registry. There were subpoenas. There were searches. Arrests followed for individuals whose hands had been more invasive than the record allowed. Those actions were undertaken under the auspices of an ongoing criminal inquiry. The language in the headlines read the way legal processes insist. Criminal proceedings began. Investigations launched. Assets frozen pending inquiry. No sentences were declared, only process. The public reaction split along familiar lines. Some who had leaned into the first narrative felt stunned and protective of the sorrow they'd consoled. Others, who had seen the earlier clumsy stitches, felt vindicated. Social feeds alternated between outrage and a kind of embarrassed self-awareness. Reporters traced the map of signatures back to a small office where Akusa had once done night work under a single lamp. Anchor hosts asked the right questions but were quick to emphasize the courtroom's due process. That was how justice moved here. Slowly, with lots of hands. Akusa watched as the story reoriented itself in the feed of public opinion. She did not gloat. She had no appetite for spectacle. She re-entered the hospital in a way that made cameras' lenses feel rude. She came as a worker, wearing a simple white blouse and a coat that was not intended to be photographed. She walked the corridors that she had helped map, past the pediatric wing where the twins had once been bundled in blankets, and past the pharmacies she had reorganized to keep essential medicines from going out of stock. Staff recognized her not as an icon, but as the person who had insisted on a particular way to count supplies and to track their use. At a board meeting the week after her first public walks, Reginald placed a sealed folder on the table and looked around at directors who had once sat in silence. He said plainly, There is documentation that must be acknowledged. The folders were then opened. They contained the original deeds, the earliest minutes of meetings where clinic acquisitions had been discussed, and memos with Akusa's directives. They contained, too, the mundane receipts that, when lined up, told the story of financial flows, where grants had been applied, how donor funds had been directed to particular community initiatives, how invoices had been authorized. The room that had once applauded Quame's statements in his staged elegies went quieter in a new register. The music of the gala lingered in the memory of chandeliers, but the boardroom had its own kind of acoustics: empty chairs, the flutter of paper, the soft clearing of throats. Cameras, which prioritized spectacle, made a clumsy translation attempt, flashing, focusing, then searching for a single face to script into a narrative. They landed necessarily on Akusa, who refused to be reduced to a photograph. Then came the gala, this time not the one that had celebrated absence, but the one arranged by people who required proof over pageantry. It was smaller, more controlled, the kind of gathering that privileges documentation over spectacle. Akusa entered the atrium in simple white. She was not a figure cut for stage light. Her dress read as practicality with dignity. She sat at a plain table, not the dais of honors, but the head of the board. There were cameras, of course. News vans lined the curb. But the tone of the evening was different. Folders were distributed with a steady hand. Reginald Osei took the podium and without flourish began to speak about stewardship. He spoke not to inflame, but to clarify. He did not issue accusations in the melodramatic style the tabloids prefer. Instead, he produced a chronology, laid out on paper and on a simple projection screen, of deeds and signings and municipal acknowledgments. He opened with the early lease of the first clinic and worked forward, point by point, until the room had no narrative space left for the earlier version that had been conjured by sympathetic grief and good lighting. When the folders were passed, photographers lowered their cameras involuntarily. Reporters read the stamped municipal copies, muttered at the looped signatures they recognized from earlier photocopies, and checked the server timestamps that Petty had arranged to preserve. The cumulative effect was not melodrama, but irrefutable clarity. The hospital had been founded and grown in a pattern that bore Akusa's hand at every hinge. In the crowd, Quame's expression changed from practiced sorrow to something thinner. Friction exposed to heat. He had thought optics would be enough. He had not expected official records to produce a different kind of light. Desire stood slightly apart, as if a wind had hurried through and knocked over the day's curated array. The room cooled with the kind of silence that comes when a commonly accepted story must be revised. Akusa spoke then, briefly. Her voice was calm and the words were small and exact. She thanked the staff, named the nurses working the night shift, Adoa among them, and reminded the assembled that the work of a hospital is not the performance of grief, but the unglamorous business of care. She did not accuse. She stated facts, and the public listened because paper had made them listen. Cameras recorded, mouths formed words, headlines rearranged themselves. The revelation was not a howl, it was a realignment. The immediate consequences were administrative and legal. Notices were served. Bank accounts were temporarily frozen, pending account verification. Some companions to the initial narrative, individuals who had positioned themselves in the house and in the social feed, found their access curtailed. Desire moved out of the family home with few public statements, claiming privacy. Gloria, previously accustomed to social prominence, retreated from the society pages while managing other appearances with a reduced profile. Bertram faced questioning over his administrative role in accessing records he should not have changed. Criminal proceedings began. Investigators followed documents like maps. Arrests were made for people who had actively altered or misrepresented official records. Those arrests were procedural, public, and did not include any claim about sentencing. In the small print of the legal world, matters were opened for discovery, and matter-of-fact hearings were scheduled. The press covered the arcs with the usual mixtures of triumph and unease. Some anchors described the operation as an unseating of a manufactured story. Others raised the quiet caution of due process. Through it all, Akusa focused on retrieval. She wanted the twins back into her care in the way a gardener wants a nursery plant returned to a proper pot. Pete and a sympathetic social worker navigated the bureaucracy of child custody and hospital policies, presenting notarized documents and clear affidavits about the founder's rights as a mother and legal guardian. The return of the twins was not a street parade, but a private reunion in Akusa's living room for which cameras were not invited. The scene was ordinary. Children in small pajamas, a blanket with a village pattern folded over the arm of a couch. The silver locket nested under a soft towel that smelled faintly of soap. When Akusa first held them both without the mediation of a hospital bed, she did so in a way that suggested both maternal instinct and executive clarity. She took their schedules into account. She called pediatric staff to confirm immunizations, and she arranged for in-home support. That is to say, she mothered them quietly, and with the same organizational intent she used to run clinics. There were moments, one twin reaching for the locket, one trying to chew the clasp, when she laughed with a softness that had no headline potential, but a new depth of contentment nonetheless. Life recentered around small rituals. Mornings had tea and pastries, coconut sweet rolls that Petty insisted were essential, and sourced from a bakery that reminded Akusa of childhood streets. They spoke in low tones about security systems and staff reassignments and the rebuilding of trust with a community whose faith had been misdirected for months. Akusa placed the village photograph on her desk, not as a prop, but as a constant checkpoint. It would witness meetings and decisions in the years ahead. She tucked the locket 2 days later under a baby blanket when the twins napped, and that image, the silver glint under a child's cheek, circulated among the people who had been closest to her work as a small private rejoinder to a long public story. The hospital's systems were audited. Where errors had been introduced, mismatched approvals, signatures that had been forged, small clerical manipulations, the team Pete assembled traced and documented them. Where operations had suffered because of leadership absence, Akusa quietly reinstated managers who had been pushed aside, promoted technicians who had been faithful, and called meetings to remind staff of operational standards. She did not make sweeping public announcements. She rewired the organization by restoring the wiring, reporting structures, supply chain checks, and personnel policies that would make the institution less vulnerable to narrative capture. There were board meetings and quiet negotiations in rooms where formerly the smallest disagreement had been smoothed by charm. In one such prolonged negotiation, Akusa sat across a table from a group of stakeholders who were used to bargaining for public attention. She made a point simply about the hospital's mission. Measurements of community health mattered more than the depth of anyone's tears. She proposed a set of transparency measures, open audits, third-party oversight, community advisory panels, details that made human optics less powerful than institutional integrity. The board accepted most of them because they were sensible and because the paper trail left little room for argument. The press, hungry for narratives, cut the story into digestible pieces. The awakening, the dossier, the gala reveal, the legal steps. There were human interest profiles about Adoa and Pete, the nurse who had read lullabies and the lawyer who had refused to let records be erased. There were also reckoning pieces about the manipulation of charity systems, about how family drama can bend public benefits into private stories. The conversation did not always land where Akusa wanted. She had no need to guide every headline. She did, however, use the moment to insist on a refocusing. The hospital existed to treat bodies, not to be a stage for personal narratives. All of that work required time. It required patience and the endurance of small, tedious tasks, signatures, certifications, the choreographed hum of institutional maintenance. Akusa did not pretend it would be quick. She attended to the detail, the kind of detail that does not please a camera but keeps a clinic freezer stocked with vaccines, keeps a record of surgeries accurate, ensures a supply of pediatric formula for the infants who rely on it. That steady labor did more for the community than any speech could. When the legal calendar advanced, there were hearings where exhibits were read aloud. Old vendor agreements were displayed on screens, and the court reporter's type formed a thin record of ordinary things: dates, initials, clerk stamps. These were not scenes meant to inflame. They were mechanisms by which complexity was reduced to checkable facts. The words in court were technical, dry, authoritative. For Akusa, each line of the hearing felt like a repair. For Pete, each verified signature was a victory of patience over theatrics. Not every person who had profited from the public lie faced criminal consequences. Some retreated quietly. Some contrived to reframe their role as merely confused or misinformed. Those outcomes mattered less to Akusa than the restoration of proper authority and the return of stewardship to its rightful place. She concentrated on building resilience, procedures that would prevent a similar co-opting in the future. She rewired governance, insisted on dual signatories for key transfers, created an independent audit committee, and brought on a diverse panel of community representatives to hold the institution accountable in ways both formal and humane. The city, which had once celebrated a narrative crafted in the light of chandeliers, slowly adapted. The hospital's donors, many of whom had been unsure where the truth lay, came to understand that their money needed better documentation. They supported, often reluctantly and sometimes with apology, the new transparency measures. Community leaders, those who had once had to beg for a clinic in their neighborhood, were given voice at advisory tables. The hospital's outreach programs, under Akusa's renewed supervision, resumed their expansion into neighborhoods that had been overlooked. Those small results mattered more to her than any plaque. In quieter moments, Akusa visited the old neighborhood she had once walked as a young woman. She walked the red dirt roads where mornings smelled of papaya and masonry dust, and she let the small, familiar things anchor her decisions. In those visits, she would sit with a grandmother who had watched her grow, and together they would talk about bread and seasons and whether the clinic's schedule matched the rhythm of market mornings. These scenes were not for public consumption. They were the small, sustaining practices of a leader who had never equivocated between motherhood and management. Pete remained at her side. They met for pastries and tea, trading jokes about forms and memos the way old friends would trade secrets. Pete kept a folder, now thicker with case notes and also with small personal items, a receipt from a bakery in Ghana, a folded note from Akusa that read, "Remember the river." They rebuilt the intimacy of a friendship that had been tested by time and law. Adoa retired from her long night vigil work some months later, not because she was tired of defending truth, but because she had done enough of it in person. Her presence at the hospital remained in a different register. She took on training new nurses in bedside manner. She taught them the lullaby and why a voice matters as much as a chart. She brought to her lessons the same patient insistence with which she'd kept watch in room 4B. That care is small acts performed with attention. The press eventually shifted to other spectacles. That is what news does. But the hospital continued its slow, steady work. The twins grew into a life where their mother's name was no longer a disputed fact. When Akusa walked the pediatric wing with one of them toddling against her leg and the other asleep on a nurse's shoulder, the photographs that circulated afterwards were not calculated but true. A woman present, affectionate, and competent. The refrain that had lived in the interior of the story, "What you build in silence will speak for you when the time comes," was no longer a proverb, but a report. It did not announce itself like a sermon. It was visible in the registry office stamps, in server timestamps, in the steady supply chains of clinics. It was present in children vaccinated in a timely manner, and in the quiet allocation of resources to neighborhoods long denied basic care. It was present when a mother 20 miles from the city could find a clinic open and staffed because Akusa had, years earlier, insisted on systems that scaled. There was no single moment of cinematic vengeance. There was instead a succession of small, undeniable facts that reoriented authority to its proper place. People who had been quick to believe a staged sorrow had to confront the ordinary stubbornness of paperwork and community memory. Those who had tried to claim a legacy that was not theirs moved away from the public eye. Some apologized privately, others simply receded. The law did its part. Investigations, freezes, procedural hearings, but in the end it was the combination of legal structure and steady leadership that reconstituted what had been nearly lost. In the slow domestic aftermath, mornings returned to an intimacy that had nothing to do with headlines. Akusa rose before the sun sometimes, brewed a pot of tea, and watched the horizon burn pink. She would feed the twins, carry them into the kitchen to sit with a newspaper. She scanned for items that mattered, and sometimes sit in a silent conversation with the village photograph hanging by a window that looked out over a small patio. The silver locket had become a talisman again. She often placed it on the twins' small blanket during naps, a private blessing, no theatrics. She sometimes held the locket and felt the weight of everything that had been accumulated in silence. Years of clinic spreadsheets, the steady negotiation of vendor contracts, quiet phone calls with community leaders at dawn. Those were the things that had, in the end, outperformed the camera's appetite for sorrow. They were unglamorous things: invoices reconciled, chain of custody forms filled, boards reconstituted with people who saw service as a responsibility, not a platform. When she thought of her grandmother, of the woman who had instructed her to pay attention, Akusa often smiled. Her grandmother had not known the language of governance and legal freezes, but she had taught a posture. Watch what moves in the cracks. Notice the gestures that reveal intention. That posture had become Akusa's quiet weapon, an insistence on the slow labor of truth. There were, of course, days when fatigue tightened its hold. The long hours, the replay of legal hearings, the strange sensation of being observed. But she had allies who understood the difference between attention and applause. Pete continued to handle the legal filings. Reginald remained a voice of institutional memory. Nurses and ground-level staff, recognized and supported in new ways, brought new ideas to continuing care. The hospital, once threatened by performative capture, seemed to settle into a steadier rhythm. A year after the first gala, the one that had framed her absence as a tragedy with an opportunistic leading man, there was a small ceremony in a courtyard behind the hospital. It was not a gala of press lights, but an event in which patients, nurses, and the community came to inaugurate a new wing that Akusa had long planned, dedicated to maternal and child health in neighborhoods that needed it most. There were no celebrity photographs. There were children with painted faces, nurses adjusting gowns, the scent of food stalls where neighbors had come to cook and sell. Akusa stood at the edge, a presence among many, and listened as local leaders thanked staff whose names now read on public rosters. Reginald gave a short introduction, noting the wing's efficacy, its funding transparency, and the governance reforms that would make such work less vulnerable to private narrative capture. He did not speak of the past with rancor. He simply placed on the record that institutions required work and that the work was often invisible. Afterwards, Akusa took a slow walk through the new ward. She stopped at a room where a mother was holding a newborn and asked about the family's needs. The woman, surprised, thanked her in a way that was ordinary and unadorned. Akusa listened and learned. She did not present herself as a savior. She was a person who had spent her life building plumbing, pipes and pumps and valves that let a community's care flow. At home, she made a point of making breakfast with the twins. She taught them small things she had learned in the village: how to peel plantain, which markets had the best yam, which vendors sold the sweetest mangoes. She tucked the locket under a quilt and watched as one of the twins reached for it with a sleepy hand and then, with the inattentive curiosity of a child, let it fall and the chain catch on a blanket seam. That image, a small silver glint against a child's hair, was the kind of photograph that did not belong on the front page, but to which she returned in private as proof of the work that mattered. She never forgot how nearly everything had almost been taken from her by a narrative that mistook performance for possession. That memory shaped the policies she enacted: mandatory transparency reports, public audits, and committees that included voices from neighborhoods whose needs were too often performed rather than met. Those changes were not dramatic. They were structural. They reduced the hospital's vulnerability to future slights and repurposed the institution toward its founding goal. When she thought of Quaame, it was not with vindictiveness. She found in time that anger dulled into a clearer appraisal. He had been a person who preferred the stage, and whose instincts had not matched the endurance the work required. Desire, whose role in the story had been to occupy a seat, moved on. Some relationships withered, others healed enough to function in a new, reconfigured community. Those processes were slow, and she let them be. There was one thing she kept doing that had nothing to do with governance. At the end of some long days, she would stand at the window of her small office, The village photograph propped on the sill, the city spread beyond in the March light. She would watch the traffic, the rhythm of people moving through their lives, and she would think about how the small, invisible labor of attention had saved a hospital and her children. She would touch the silver locket and feel the memory of a grandmother's hand in it. The refrain, "What you build in silence will speak for you when the time comes," no longer needed repeating. It had done its work. It had become a quiet fact of life. When the twins were old enough to walk to the corner store with a small list, they did so under the watchful but unperformative eye of their mother. She taught them to notice small things, how to ask a clerk for a receipt, to keep lists, to make sure a promise was recorded. She believed in teaching by example, in the same way she had always done in the clinics. Show up, count carefully, document, and then do the work again. At night, when the house was quiet and the twins slept, Akusa sometimes took out the locket and opened it. The photograph inside had faded a little around the edges, but the two small figures under the mango tree were still there, tiny, decisive, patient. She would lay the locket on the table and breathe, thinking of how, in the end, the work had spoken. She never asked the world to love her story. She only wanted it to be true. The work of rebuilding the hospital, re-establishing stewardship, and reclaiming the rightful authorship of a community's care had been quieter than the rumors that had once surrounded her absence. It was steadier, more patient, and ultimately less dramatic than the cameras would have preferred. In time, the spectacles that had once followed her life transformed into another kind of acknowledgement. Not memorials or tributes, but operational improvements and community testimonials. Patients who had once waited 3 hours for a basic clinic visit found themselves seen in 30 minutes. A registry that had been vulnerable to manipulation was replaced by a system with checks and community oversight. The clinic expansion plan she had drawn years earlier finally found funding and independent oversight. People would sometimes ask later how she had managed to hold both motherhood and leadership without letting one obscure the other. Her answer, when she gave one, was simple and practical. She spoke about the logistics, schedules, competent staff, clear handoffs, and the willingness to ask for help. She would say with a small wry smile that the two roles required the same skill set: attention, long-term planning, and the persistence to follow through on small things day after day. There was, too, the sometimes unspoken element of legacy. Akusa thought of her grandmother's fingers and of the village where nights smelled of papaya and rain. She thought of the idea her grandmother had pressed into her palm like a small, ancient tool. Pay attention. Attention, it turned out, was the architect's most useful instrument. Years later, at a small community symposium celebrating maternal health outcomes in the region, a young woman stood up in the audience and asked the founder a question that was less about governance and more about courage. "How did you keep going when everyone told you a different story?" she asked. Akusa looked at her and for the first time let a public softness enter her voice. She did not recite the legal steps, or the audits, or the board reforms. She spoke instead of the small things: the nurse who read lullabies, the friend who kept photocopies safe in a server, the grandmother's locket, the list of names tucked in a folder. She spoke of the quiet work and the long patience required to ensure truth had a place to land. "What you build in silence will speak for you when the time comes," she said finally, not as a judgment but as a lived fact. It hung in the room like the memory of a song. The woman in the audience nodded as if given permission to believe in small, practical courage. The symposium closed with modest applause. People returned to their clinics and their desks and their lives, carrying with them the small grammar of an ethic that misplaced spectacle for service. At home that evening, Akusa tucked the twins into bed. She placed the silver locket under the blanket like a small benediction and stood for a moment at the doorway. The house was quiet, but not empty. There was the sound of the fridge humming in the kitchen and the distant thrum of a city that had once been distracted but now relied in small ways on the structure she had helped build. She walked to the window and looked at the city lights, a soft constellation over streets where people lived out their unremarked acts of care. She breathed in the cool night air and felt the slow satisfaction that comes from the work of long habit finally bearing its fruit. She had not sought a spotlight, She had sought a system. Adoa visited sometimes with a plate of fried plantain and news stories about the nurses who listened. Pete called with legal updates and with invitations for breakfast at a bakery that made the same coconut rolls they had eaten during the struggle. Reginald came by to consult on an advisory panel and to remember, in the way old friends do, the small signatures on ancient deeds. In the end, the hospital ran under the name that had always belonged to her. Not because she demanded it with speeches, but because the record showed it, and because the work proved it. The hospital doors bore the name in bronze, and that bronze mattered because it was backed by paperwork and practice. On a quiet afternoon, holding one twin on her hip and watching the other chase a cricket in the garden, she touched the locket and felt the chain warm under her fingers. She had learned to build without spectacle and to let the evidence of work do its own justice. The saga of betrayal and attempted usurpation had been terrible and instructive, but it had not defined her. It had clarified what needed defending: institutions of care, the records that protect them, and the people who do the daily work. When she closed the locket and tucked it into a baby blanket again, it felt less like a trophy and more like a map. She had returned to what mattered: the children, the clinics, the small acts of governance that would protect the work for the coming generations. If this story moves you, if the quiet labor of rebuilding and the patience of small acts resonates, hit like and subscribe for more stories of resilience. Later, when she would tell her twins about the village under the mango tree and about a grandmother who taught her to notice, she would speak in that soft voice, not to inflame but to instruct. She would teach them the same things she had been taught: notice the details, keep the receipts, hold together the community with steady hands. And when people asked briefly how a woman had been able to translate heartbreak into structural reform, some would point to the papers, some to the legal victories, and some to the public record. Akusa would simply look at the window and her children and say, as if describing weather, "We paid attention." Tell us one word that describes Akusa. Drop it in the comments.